Imagine the roar of a BMW 801 radial engine screaming at full throttle. You're sitting in the cockpit of a Focke-Wulf 190, the Butcher Bird, the most lethal fighter in the German Luftwaffe. Below you, the landscape of the Third Reich is a blur of fire and steel. But as you look out over the wings marked with the Iron Cross, you realize you have a catastrophic problem. The Allied anti-aircraft batteries stationed along the front lines aren't cheering for you. They see a Nazi predator diving toward them, and they are opening fire with everything they've got. To them, you are the enemy. To the Germans behind you, you are a thief and a traitor who just pulled off the most daring prison break in the history of warfare. The man behind the stick isn't a Nazi. He's an American pilot named Bob Hoover. He has no parachute. He has no flight manual. He has no radio contact with his own side. And 5 minutes ago, he was a prisoner of war rotting in the Stalag Luft I camp. Most men would have been happy just to climb over the fence. Bob Hoover decided to steal the pride of the German Air Force instead. But how does a man who's been starved in a POW camp for over a year manage to hotwire a foreign fighter plane under heavy guard? How do you fly a machine you've never touched before through a sky filled with people trying to kill you? And more importantly, when your own allies are locking their sights onto your cockpit, how do you convince them not to pull the trigger? This is the impossible true story of a flight that should have ended in a fireball. This is how Bob Hoover turned a 0% chance of survival into the greatest escape of World War II. If you think you know what nerves of steel look like, you haven't seen anything yet. To understand how Bob Hoover ended up in the cockpit of a Nazi fighter, you first have to understand the man who broke every rule in the flight manual before he even left the ground. Long before he became an aviation legend, Bob Hoover was a kid from Tennessee who got airsick on his first flight. Most people would have taken that as a sign to stay on the ground. Hoover, he went back up the next day, and the day after that, performing aerobatics until his stomach finally surrendered to his will. By the time World War II broke out, Hoover wasn't just a pilot. He was a test pilot prodigy. He was the guy the Army Air Forces sent to push experimental planes to their absolute breaking point. But in February 1944, while flying his 59th mission over the coast of occupied France, his luck ran out. A mechanical failure in his Spitfire, or a lucky shot from a Focke-Wulf, accounts vary, sent his plane spiraling toward the Mediterranean. He was captured by a German merchant ship, handed over to the Gestapo, and eventually thrown into Stalag Luft I, a high-security prison camp on the Baltic coast. This wasn't a Hollywood movie set. This was a frozen hellscape where 9,000 Allied officers were crammed into wooden barracks, surviving on kohlrabi soup, essentially hot water with a few rotten turnip peels. Hoover spent 16 months in that cage. He dropped nearly 60 pounds. His ribs were visible, his skin was sallow, and his spirit was being systematically ground down by the constant threat of execution. For a man whose entire identity was built on the freedom of the sky, being grounded in a barbed wire box was a psychological torture worse than the hunger. He spent every waking second studying the guards, the fences, and the patterns of the Luftwaffe planes flying overhead. He wasn't just looking for a way out, he was looking for a way back up. By April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. The Soviet Red Army was closing in from the east, with a reputation for brutality that terrified even the hardened Nazi guards. The German command at Stalag Luft I faced a choice: stay and be slaughtered by the Russians, or run. They chose to run. One morning, the prisoners woke up to find the towers empty and the gates unlocked. Technically, they were free. But freedom, in the middle of a collapsing war zone, is a death sentence. The American senior officers gave a strict order: stay in the camp. They knew that thousands of starving, ragged men wandering into the path of the retreating German army or the advancing Soviets would lead to a massacre. But Bob Hoover didn't do orders well when there was a chance to fly. He looked at his friend, Jerry Tallis, and said, "I'm not waiting for a bus that isn't coming." They climbed over the fence, bypassed the liberated gates, and disappeared into the woods. They stole bicycles from a local farm, pedaling through the chaos of a dying empire, dodging patrols and hiding in ditches. They weren't looking for the American lines. They were looking for an airfield. Finally, they found it. Deep in the woods near the town of Barth sat a small, auxiliary Luftwaffe base. Most of the personnel had fled, but the hangars were still there. And sitting on the tarmac, fueled and armed, was the Focke-Wulf 190. To a pilot, the FW-190 was a masterpiece, the butcher bird. To an American POW, it was a death trap. Hoover had never seen the inside of a German cockpit. He couldn't read the labels on the gauges. He didn't know the startup sequence. He didn't even know if the engine would turn over before a stray German patrol spotted them and ended the story right there on the runway. He climbed into the seat, his heart hammering against his malnourished ribs. He reached for the starter, praying he wouldn't blow the engine or trigger a self-destruct charge. But as the massive BMW radial engine roared to life, coughing out a cloud of blue smoke, Hoover realized something that made his blood run cold. The plane wasn't just sitting there by accident. It hadn't been abandoned in the rush to escape. As he looked at the fuel gauge and the state of the landing gear, he realized the Germans hadn't left this plane for him to steal. They had left it as a decoy, rigged with a mechanical poison pill designed to kill anyone brave or stupid enough to try and fly it. The poison pill wasn't a bomb. It was worse. As the needles on the German gauges began to dance, Hoover realized the landing gear was jammed halfway. One wheel was locked, the other was dangling like a broken limb. In a Focke-Wulf, that's a death sentence. At takeoff speeds, a lopsided gear will catch the ground, flip the 5-ton fighter, and turn the cockpit into a coffin before you even clear the trees. He had 2 seconds to make a choice: shut it down and run back to the woods, or gamble his life on a machine that was actively trying to kill him. Hoover slammed the throttle forward. The BMW engine didn't just roar, it screamed. The FW-190 lurched across the grass, vibrating so violently Hoover's vision blurred. The plane pulled hard to the left, fighting to ground loop. He kicked the rudder with everything his starved legs had left. His muscles cramped. His heart hammered. The end of the field was coming up fast, a wall of jagged pines. He yanked the stick back. The butcher bird groaned, clawed at the air, and cleared the tree line by inches. He was airborne, he was free, but he was also flying a giant, flying target. Hoover looked down at the cockpit floor. No parachute. He looked at the wings. Huge black iron crosses stared back at him. To every Allied pilot in the sky, he wasn't Bob Hoover from Tennessee. He was a Nazi hunter, looking for a kill. He stayed low on the deck, as pilots say, weaving through valleys to stay off the radar. But flying low meant he was a target for every bored teenager with an anti-aircraft gun on the ground. He passed over a small village, and suddenly the sky lit up. Tracer fire. Bright, glowing streaks of lead arching toward his canopy. His own side was shooting at him. British Bofors guns were chewing up the air around him. Hoover didn't have a radio to tell them to stop. He didn't have a white flag. He did the only thing a test pilot knows how to do. He pushed the plane to its absolute limit. He dived. He rolled. He pulled G-forces that should have made him black out in his weakened state. He escaped the flak. But as he crossed the lines into Allied-occupied Holland, he saw a new nightmare in his rearview mirror. 2 P-51 Mustangs, the fastest, deadliest American fighters in the world. And they had just spotted a lone Focke-Wulf wandering into their territory. They weren't going to ask questions. They were going to earn a victory mark. Hoover watched the Mustangs peel off, diving for his tail. In a straight line, he was fast. But the FW-190 was heavy, and he was running out of fuel. He saw the flashes from their wings. The .50 caliber machine guns were waking up. He couldn't fight back. Even if he knew how to fire the German cannons, he refused to kill his own countrymen. He had to show them he was a friend. But how do you signal "I'm American" while sitting inside a Nazi war machine? He began to wiggle his wings violently. He dropped his landing gear, the broken, dangling gear, as a sign of surrender. It was a universal signal. I'm not a threat. I'm struggling. The Mustang pilots hesitated. They pulled alongside him, close enough for Hoover to see the goggles on the American pilots. Hoover took both hands off the controls and held them high above his head. He waved like a madman. He pointed to himself, screaming into a cockpit that no one could hear. The lead Mustang pilot stared at him for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, the American gave a thumbs up. They didn't shoot. Instead, they took up positions on his wingtips, escorting this strange, ghost-like Nazi plane toward a liberated airfield. But the danger wasn't over. Hoover looked at his fuel gauge. It was dead. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then silence. The massive propeller slowed to a halt, windmilling in the air. He was a 5-ton glider. Below him wasn't a paved runway. It was a muddy field in the middle of a Dutch farm, surrounded by a crowd of French civilians and British soldiers who had just spent years being bombed by planes that looked exactly like the one Hoover was flying. He had no engine. He had 1.5 landing gears, and he was heading straight for a group of people who were already reaching for their rifles. If the crash didn't kill him, the welcoming committee would. Hoover lined up the field. He touched down on the grass, the one locked wheel digging into the mud, the other wing dragging behind. The plane spun. Dirt and metal flew everywhere. The canopy shattered. The WWII slid for 100 yards, trailing a cloud of dust and smoke, before coming to a violent, bone-jarring halt right in front of a British military outpost. Hoover sat in the wreckage, gasping for air. His ribs ached. His hands were shaking. He waited for the cheers. He waited for the welcome home. Instead, he heard the sound of a dozen bolts being pulled back. He looked up to see a circle of British infantrymen pointing Lee-Enfield rifles at his head. They didn't see a hero. They saw a German pilot who had just crashed into their backyard. A British sergeant stepped forward, his face twisted in rage. He didn't ask for identification. He didn't ask for a name. He raised his pistol, aimed it right between Hoover's eyes, and prepared to finish the job. Hoover realized he had escaped a Nazi prison, stolen a fighter plane, and survived a dogfight with his own allies, only to be executed on a farm in Holland by the very men he was trying to reach. He had one chance to say something, one sentence, to prove he wasn't the enemy. But as he opened his mouth, he realized his throat was so dry from the flight that he couldn't make a sound. The silence that blanketed the Dutch fields at that moment was even more terrifying than the previous roar of the BMW engine. Bob Hoover stared into the muzzle of the British sergeant's rifle, feeling the coldness of death just one trigger pull away. He tried to swallow hard, his throat burning from gun smoke and months of lingering hunger and thirst. Finally, with all the strength remaining in his gaunt chest, he screamed the words he had yearned to say for the past 16 months, in an unmistakable, thick Tennessee accent. "Don't shoot! I'm an American pilot. I just escaped from Stalag Luft I." The muzzle lowered. The fierce glare of the sergeant shifted from suspicion to astonishment, and finally to an unspeakable respect. They looked at the man who was nothing but skin and bones, standing next to the shattered carcass of the butcher bird, and realized they had just witnessed the impossible. Bob Hoover had done it. He had crossed 300 miles of hostile airspace, survived rounds from his own allies, and landed a heavily damaged fighter without a parachute, without a radio, and without a single second of training. But the story of Bob Hoover did not end in that muddy field. In fact, it was merely the opening chapter for a legend who would change the face of the global aviation industry forever. Upon returning to the U.S., instead of choosing a quiet life after the psychological and physical trauma of war, Hoover threw himself back into the sky with a passion more intense than ever. He became the top test pilot for the United States Air Force, the man chosen to fly wingtip to wingtip with Chuck Yeager in the historic mission to break the sound barrier in the Bell X-1. If Yeager was the first human to exceed the speed of sound, Hoover was the backup pilot, the only one qualified enough to save the day if anything went wrong. All the open loops about the 0% chance of survival, or the mechanical trap left behind by Nazi Germany, now had their most satisfying answer. The poison pill of the FW-190 could not kill him, because for a man who had conquered his own body's nausea since he was a child, and conquered death in a concentration camp, no technical malfunction was insurmountable. His ability to control an aircraft was not just a skill, it was pure survival instinct. Decades later, the world knew Bob Hoover as the pilot's pilot. He demonstrated techniques that scientists deemed impossible, shutting down both engines of his Shrike Commander to perform perfect aerobatics, then gently touching down on the runway in absolute silence. When asked how he could maintain such uncanny calmness in the direst situations, Hoover only smiled. The answer lay in that 1945 flight stolen from the hands of the Grim Reaper. Bob Hoover didn't just steal a Nazi aircraft, he stole his own fate back from the hands of destiny. He proved that when human will is great enough, an iron cage can become a launch pad, and an enemy's killing machine can become the wings to freedom. The legacy he left behind is not medals or speed records, but the most vivid proof of the saying, "No sky is too high for a man who never accepts being held down by the ground." From a starving prisoner of war to the greatest icon of the skies, Bob Hoover's journey is a reminder that even in history's darkest hours, the human spirit can fly higher than any muzzle or wall of fire. The story of Bob Hoover is proof that the only limits we have are the ones we choose to accept. But history does not have only one Bob Hoover, and the sky still holds breathtaking mysteries of people who turned the impossible into reality through insane courage. If you feel driven by these journeys of overcoming adversity and want to explore deeper into the hidden corners of aviation history where genius minds and the bravest hearts once intersected, hit the subscribe button to continue this journey of exploring human limits with us. And right now, to better understand the legendary partner, Hoover stood beside the man who truly ripped the sky apart and surpassed the physical limits of sound. You cannot miss the video on Chuck Yeager and the historic mission on the Bell X-1 appearing on your screen. It is another chapter of bravery, another rung on the ladder of human ambition that you certainly won't want to miss. We will meet again on the other side of the sound barrier.